All right, so on the debate of voter identification laws, you're going to have two sides to the story. Basically, you're going to have those who argue for identification laws, and that's going to be their argument's going to be that voter identification laws help prevent voter fraud and they protect the integrity of our elections. And then those who argue against voter identification laws are going to say that voter identification laws basically target disadvantaged groups and they suppress those groups because those groups may not have the ability to obtain a form of valid identification. Now, I would say that voter identification laws are going to help prevent vote fraud, and they protect the integrity of our elections more so than they suppress certain disadvantaged groups. Let's start out at the history. In the beginning, let me rephrase that. Let's start out with the history of voter identification laws. So in the beginning, most states didn't have many laws or they didn't enforce their laws. So then compared to now, times progress, things change, and now most states do have some form of voter identification laws. Right now we have 36 states, including Missouri, that have some type of law protecting against integrity and voter fraud, whether that be a photo ID, non-photo ID, and those laws are either strictly enforced or non-strictly enforced. And then the classifications on strict versus non-strict are basically strict. Strict enforcement is going to be you show up to your poll place and you don't have a valid form of ID. You can still cast your vote. You can still cast a ballot. But with the strict enforcement, you would have to show up after election day with the valid form of identification in order for your vote to count. Now, with non-strict enforcement, there's no further action required by the voter. Instead, it's the poll worker's job and the poll worker's responsibility to verify the voter and to basically decide whether or not their vote is going to count or not. So now, with non-strict photo identification and non-photo ID, basically there's going to be a few more states that are choosing to have non-strict enforcement as compared to strict. And those states, starting with photo ID, are going to be Alabama, Florida, Idaho, Louisiana, Michigan, Montana, Rhode Island, South Dakota, South Carolina, and Texas. And then states that are choosing to have non-strict, non-photo ID voter identification laws are going to be Alaska, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Utah, Virginia, Washington, and West Virginia. And then states that are going to have strict enforcement or basically further action required by the voter. States that have photo ID and they're strictly enforcing photo identification are going to be Arkansas, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. And states that are strictly enforcing non-photo ID are going to be Arizona, North Dakota, Ohio, and Wyoming. And then there's also a few arguments for the argument that voter identification laws suppress certain disadvantaged groups. And a couple of my favorites are that those who are part of these disadvantaged groups can't afford cars, so they don't have a driver's license. So they can't get to the DMV to obtain a valid form of ID to go vote. If you don't have a car and you don't have a driver's license, how do you plan on getting to the DMV to get a form of identification, let alone going to your poll place to cast a ballot? So if you can't get to your DMV, how do you plan on getting to your poll place to cast a ballot to vote? That's just doesn't make very much sense as an argument. And then another one is that these groups can't afford to lose a day at work. Now, if you can't afford to lose a day at work, that means you do have a workplace and you do have a job. And if you have a job, you have a form of identification, whether it be a driver's license or a birth certificate. You have some form of identification because your workplace has to set you up with taxation forms and a bank account and get you on payroll. They've got to have information about you and they've got to have a form of ID to get that information. So basically that argument, it's a pretty weak argument and it's not supported either. So in the end, I would say that voter identification laws help to support and protect the integrity of our elections and protect against voter fraud more so than they suppress disadvantaged groups from voting. Thank you for listening.